Thank you all very much. I've had a chance these past few days to say hello to a number of you, not to all. I hope to do so before leaving tomorrow. And I want to say above all how very much I appreciate the invitation to participate in the Salzburg Global Seminar. As George mentioned, I was first here a year ago when I was privileged to speak from this very podium as part of the faculty of a session on the future of the world trading system. I enjoyed that very much, and at about that same time I'd begun to do some new work in the world that led us to this week in our sustainability seminar. I have a day job. Yorgos, I am in the private sector, and I'm happy to be. And much of the time I work as a mere lawyer in roaming the world, but I'm also these days roaming far and wide to try to find ways where I might be able to serve and continue to contribute without running for any other office or without going through any confirmation process. So that takes me far from Florida and far from Washington and far from home. Claire, who's doing just a terrific job for this place, has given me instructions this afternoon. She wants me to return us from the infinite to the finite, I think she put it, and to try to unite the three themes that are the overarching themes going forward for the seminar. And given what we've already heard, that's pretty easy to do. We could all of us perhaps do that, but I'm limited in that I'm not a scientist and I'm not an artist, so I have to do this through the prism of the experience I do have, which is, for better or worse, as a politician, a jurist, and occasionally a writer. But even there, it's still fairly easy to do, because what is necessary simply is to point to the contrast between last night and this morning. Last night, we saw, especially in a riveting 30 seconds, taking us through 2 centuries, the massive collective failure thus far of humanity to face the reality of where we are and the challenge that we share in seizing and shaping a brighter future. And this morning, we were shown in contrast just how badly we failed on climate by just how much we've succeeded in other ways. Through the Mars rover. I was in the back row crying along with others, and Karen had to find me a tissue. I mean, that was just wonderful. And then the remarkable story of CERN and the way in which we're trying to make collisions between art and science there. Now, the politician in me can't help but point out a couple of aspects, antecedents of this, that would remind us of just how important the particulars of human decision-making about the future can be. Because our friends at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory at NASA certainly know and will recall, much of what you saw this morning was approved by the Congress of the United States 20 years ago, while I was there, by one vote. The vote in the House of Representatives to approve the building of the International Space Station, for example, was a vote of 218 to 217. Also, I've been to CERN. I went there in one of my other guises as a member of the law faculty at Vanderbilt with the Chancellor of Vanderbilt, so that we could get to know the Europeans who are in charge of CERN, because they very kindly let Americans get in line to use the facility along with 100 other nations. Now, one might ask, why is that necessary? It's because 20 years ago, in another vote in the House of Representatives in the United States Congress, we decided not to build a superconducting supercollider in the United States. And there's a big hole in the ground somewhere in central Texas right now that could have been a much bigger super collider than the one the world shares, thankfully, at CERN. I was in Geneva for the better part of a decade and was reminded at every time that I wish I'd been able to get just a few more votes at that time. All of this made me think of something else, which I also mentioned in our session last week. Liz will recall to those who were assembled there from 27 countries. My former congressional district in Florida included the Kennedy Space Center, Cape Canaveral. So every time a shuttle crew would come back from a mission, they would come to Washington dutifully to parade around the Capitol and try to promote the program so we could get a few more votes. And they would come to see me. They already had my vote, but they were looking for my latest list of who they should lobby. Visit. And to a person, these shuttle crews all told me independently every time exactly the same thing. They said, you know, Jim, when we're up there circling the Earth in the space shuttle and looking down on the planet, we don't see all those lines that are on the map. The lines are artificial. Those lines on the map exist only because we believe they do. Now, I'm not visionary enough to suggest that we abolish those lines. We'll leave that for future generations to consider. The lines seem to move around over time. But the lines exist, and one of the realities we face in trying to transform politics and law into something worthy of our imagination in terms of global sustainability is to figure out what we're going to do about those lines. And the lines are not just lines on a map. We are divided in many other ways. And I would say that the first challenge we face is to see the world as one place and see ourselves as one people. And then, and only then, can we find ways to come together as one people in our one world to share in the fullest measure of our common humanity. But how do we do this? I think the first antecedent to anything approaching a way to govern the world more effectively and sustainably and justly and imaginatively is to find new ways of seeing other people. We were advised this morning that in terms of the collision between art and science, we need to find new ways of seeing. But I think in political science, in the ways in which we somehow decide our fate as a planet, in which we govern ourselves, we need to find new ways of seeing other people. We need to move beyond all the old stereotypes of all kinds. These two are artificial. We may look different. We may be of different colors. We may be of different sexes. We may be from what we call different countries. We may be from very different cultures. We may be taller or shorter. We may be older or younger. We may be in the business community. We may be in government. We may be Americans or Europeans or Chinese, but we need to see our common humanity. We need to understand that all that unites us is far more important than all that divides us. Only then will we be able to move beyond that to even talk about pursuing global justice. There's another prerequisite I believe we need, and if you're interested in a lengthier exposition of what I'm about to say, you can read an essay called Lecky's Circle, which is the last chapter in a book that I published called Trade and Freedom. And that's simply this: we need to widen the circle of our personal concern. This is not a new observation. This is a debate that Aristotle and Plato had long before anyone thought about sustainability in terms of climate change, but it is fundamental. Aristotle told us that it's only natural that we be concerned most about ourselves and those who are most closely related to us and nearest to us in our own, in his time, polis, city. Plato didn't like that, and he sought a way in which we could share in an equal concern for everyone, even to the point of proposing in his ideal state that children be removed from their families and be raised collectively by the state. For the record, I think that's the wrong remedy. But I do believe we need to get to the point where we begin to see that our self-interest, our concern as individuals is caught up in a concern not just with those nearest and dearest to us, but with people on the far side of the world. And surely everything that's happening in terms of climate change and the interconnectedness of all of those sustainability issues and the interconnectedness of the global economy should at least tell us that what happens to someone somewhere else affects us and should therefore be vital to us. And then I'd say the third prerequisite to any consideration of what might be a just world should be an enlightened self-interest. I'm not one of those people who believes that we can change human nature. I believe that we share a common nature. This is one of the things that unites us, and it's American of me to say so, but I think we need to recognize that and appeal, as one of our founders said, to the better angels of our nature and the structures that we establish for governing ourselves. Well, how do we do that? How do we get beyond, as we discussed this week, the short-termism of the next election or even the next quarterly profit? Not easy to do. But I think in both public and private enterprises, we must take a different approach to defining our self-interest. And here I go back to a famous observation by a Frenchman after he came to America in the 1830s, Alexis de Tocqueville. He wrote a famous book called Democracy in America, in which he observed at the time that what made America unique and Americans successful at that time was that the Americans understood, as he phrased it, the principle of interest rightly understood. Now, what was the principle of interest rightly understood? In Tocqueville's view, it was the notion that we need to look at our own personal self-interest not in the narrow sense, but in the broadest possible sense, and not in the near term, but in the long term. And we can readily see how this translates into what I've been saying about a sustainable future in which we can imaginatively find ways to create a just world. So where do we go once we have the right, as they say, consciousness, in which once we have the right attitude, once we stop seeing people as stereotypes, once we understand that we need to see the whole circle of the world as one, and in which we look at the world and what we need to do about it through the prism of an enlightened self-interest that looks to the broad and the long term. Well, I would say, and here I become a lawyer, we need more and better rules. Sustainability is indeed connected, but how do we connect it in ways that work? And my answer is we do so with rules. My topic is justice. What does justice have to do with rules? Well, let me see if I can make that particular connection. I believe that the only kind of just world is a world in which each of us as individuals can be truly free. The lawyer in me says, how does one define free? What is freedom? I would say that freedom, individual human freedom, is the ability to make the most personal decisions about how you choose to live. Not to have those decisions made for you by circumstance, by autocrat, but to make those decisions yourself. the more personal decisions you can make about how you wish to live, the freer you are. It's about choice. Freedom is choosing. And in the context in which we've been discussing, it doesn't matter if, for the fate of the world, if Jim Bacchus happens to be free to do that. I'm a very fortunate guy. I don't think any of us are truly free unless all of us are fully free. So freedom in a just world must be equally available to all of us. We must, all of us, equally have a chance to the fullest measure of our dignity. Well, that's quite a proposition, isn't it? We're some ways from that, aren't we? I would suggest in the long sweep of history, we're a lot closer to it than we used to be, but that it is of small consolation to billions of people in the world who are not free at all. Think, for example, of that family sitting beneath that tree in the desert of Africa trying to find some shade last night. I would say they're not free. How do we make them free? What can we do to create freedom and thereby create justice? I think it can only be done within the framework of the rule of law. And here I am hesitant to be too definitive, because in this very room we have two of the most eminent legal scholars and jurists on the planet, and Judge Goldstone here, and then my friend Ambassador Gardner. I'm hoping they will weigh in afterwards, and if they correct me, I will stand corrected. But I believe that freedom is only possible within the framework of the rule of law. Anything else is chaos. Freedom alone makes, the rule of law alone makes freedom possible. Well, what is the rule of law? Another definition. The rule of law is when the law applies to all of us equally and we are all equal before the law. Therefore, what's ultimately most important is not what the law says, it's what the law does. It's the application of the law in our daily lives. This is why the World Bank and others have, for example, repeatedly said that the most important indicator of whether we have the rule of law is whether we have an independent judiciary, one that is free from political influence, that does not make arbitrary decisions, one in which that family beneath that, we hope, shady tree in Central Africa will be treated the same as you or me. That's the rule of law. And in most places in the world, we don't have it. And I would also suggest, contrary to what some suggested earlier this week in our seminar, that the rule of law is only possible where we have democracy. Democracy alone produces the rule of law, because the rule of law is not something that is imposed upon us by someone else. It's something that we create ourselves, that we have a say in making. And the only way that the ordinary person down at the grassroots of the planet, 1 among 7 billion and more, can have a say is if we have democracy. Now, democracy may not be working exactly as it should, but the answer is not to turn away from democracy. The answer is to find better ways to make democracy work more effectively. People in Europe certainly know that, who remember the 1920s and the 1930s and beyond, and I'm hoping that we Americans don't have to learn that same lesson, and I'm hoping that we don't yield to the notion that somehow democracy doesn't work anymore and it's only a command economy by some supposed philosopher king that will work. Because, as was asked about Plato's philosopher king, that watchdog that he wanted to set over the republic, who will watch the watchdog? There are no new issues in political philosophy. Now, what are some examples about how we might create rules, create a framework? Here I come to trade, where I have some experience. I went to Geneva and spent a decade as a judge at the WTO for two reasons. First, I believe that by lowering barriers to trade and investment worldwide, we can increase overall global prosperity and make it possible for more people everywhere to have more freedom, because they will have at least the possibility of being able to make more personal choices about their own future. But I also believe that by creating the international rule of law in trade, we could prove that such a thing as the international rule of law was possible. We have 40,000 international agreements that have been duly notified to the United Nations and put in, I guess, a cabinet somewhere or a storage area, international treaties. Very few of them are enforceable. Many of them are ignored. The WTO agreement has enforcement mechanisms through the power of economic suasion. So it's controversial because it can't be ignored. It's effective because it can't be ignored. You have to deal with it. And those are rules that can be a framework for doing the things that we're talking about. If we don't like the rules, we can change them. And some of us are trying to change them now by promoting a sustainable energy trade agreement, by eliminating barriers to trade in agriculture. The problem in agriculture is not that we've given primacy to efficiency. The problem in agriculture and affecting the food supply is that we have not. We have subsidies throughout the world, especially in the United States and Europe, that distort agricultural trade and deny the efficiency of the marketplace and impoverish poor people all over the planet and deny them the benefit of their own comparative advantage in producing agricultural goods and shipping them to us. And I would say that the private sector has an important role in this. Liz and I were both in Rio last summer, where she played a major role, and I was on the sidelines giving speeches and meeting with people and trying to move things forward. She can enlighten us more, but one of my conclusions was those who would lead us by governing us aren't doing very much, but out in the private sector and in civil society, people are coming together to move forward in some unique ways. And what we need to do in finding the rules that will help us create an imaginable, sustainable, and just future is to scale up and emulate a lot of those experiments that are working very well worldwide. And that was a topic for us this week. Let me say this in conclusion. While I was in the Congress, I was involved in transforming what ultimately became our International Space Station from what began as a national endeavor to what became an international endeavor. It is an international space station. We did that for two reasons. One was a very practical reason. We couldn't get enough money domestically out of the appropriations process. I'm a practical guy. But the other was simply this. I believe that the exploration of space ultimately should be the common endeavor of humanity. I don't know anyone involved in the U.S. space program who disagrees with me. And I think it's going to take our combined energies and entrepreneurial instincts and imagination to get beyond where Voyager 1 now is and take us on to other stars. One thing we should understand when we see how small the world is how much we are alike. And I would suggest that if the exploration of space is a common endeavor for all of humanity, then the salvation of this one and only planet we know and have likewise must be a common endeavor. And I would suggest that the only way we can make it so is within a framework of agreed rules that are upheld and enforced through the international rule of law. Thank you all very much.